So welcome back to A History of Coffee. This is the second part of a two-part episode about the history of Guatemala and coffee. If you haven't heard the first episode, I strongly suggest that you do. But in any case, Jonathan, please give us a quick refresher. What did we cover in the last episode?
Guatemala is inhabited by its indigenous people who commonly owned and cultivated the land. But things change once the Spanish arrive, and especially actually when Guatemala, the country, gains its independence. Because that ruling European elite aimed to modernise the country, focusing on coffee as the key export crop. So what they do is pass a law in 1871, confiscates the indigenous communal land, sell off that land to German plantation owners, and then the indigenous are coerced into working it, and many of them are left very, very poor. And we see a huge rise in inequality between the two, which ultimately sparks that long-lasting civil war between a large amount of the indigenous population against an American-backed military ruling elite.
A very dark time when almost 200,000 indigenous people were killed, often indiscriminately.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So this is where we are by the 90s. But of course, in the 90s, something really begins to transform the coffee world.
Specialty coffee.
Taking bigger and bigger strides as a very small industry.
Yeah, taking wing.
So here in part 2, we look at the story of how specialty coffee changes the story for the indigenous people of Guatemala. Coffee, as a tool of oppression, finally offers hope. And then something a bit more complicated. Let's return to Ted Fisher to take us into this next part of the story. As you mentioned, Jonathan, many of the large, historically German plantation owners, they had farms down in the lowlands. The coffee was good, but it was still a commodity coffee.
It was a quality product when it was introduced in the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Guatemala has retained a reputation for quality coffee, but quality commodity coffee, right? Quality coffee going into supermarket bags and things like that.
So then in the late 1990s, specialty coffee, as we say, is starting to take off. And there's a strong view in specialty coffee that the higher up a coffee is grown, the more likely it is to have specialty flavours.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem, of course, for the German producers, the big coffee-owning families in Guatemala, is their farms are now suddenly in the wrong place.
These German farmers have been working at relatively low elevations, 750 to 1,350 meters.
In order to grow your specialty quality at higher elevations, it's got to be up in those lands that, as we said, were still in the hands of the indigenous, up in the mountains, the higher elevation.
And then when this quality turned, looking at better coffees, which meant higher elevation coffees, production started moving up into these Mayan communities in the highlands. And so you had a lot of people starting to grow coffee that didn't before. And it makes all kinds of sense. Many of them had worked seasonally on plantations, so they kind of knew the routine. They're agriculturalists, so they're very familiar with working the land. It ties into the agricultural cycles of rural communities in a way that makes sense to them. And there was a market for it.
And so as Ted tells us, as these Mayan communities start to grow coffee, specialty coffees, of course, specialty coffees attract a higher price than commodity coffees. And this made a big change for all these communities.
And indeed, in the 2000s, we see a real boom in Mayan coffee producing communities. The prices that they're able to get are going up. They start buying cell phones. The more successful, try and buy a truck or add indoor plumbing or something to their house. So it's success on a relative scale, right? They're not buying helicopters.
And speaking with Juan Jose, somebody from the community of Jacaltenango, up near the border of Mexico, he tells me that now this is where most of Guatemala's smallholder coffee farmers are, up in the mountains.
It is the department where you have the most small coffee farmers, right?
But he caveated that, saying, This is the case because his community were able to keep their lands, unlike all the indigenous down in the lowlands who had their lands confiscated and sold to the German settlers.
And that it's only because they were able to safeguard their land.
And in some ways, they were the lucky ones who they weren't kicked off their land.
Exactly, yeah. So that's some of the strange ways in which history unfolds sometimes.
But Jonathan, this is kind of curious for me because obviously in the history of Guatemala, coffee has been this tool of extraction that's caused so much suffering and intergenerational poverty for the indigenous who lost their land and were forced to work for almost nothing on these plantations. And so I was curious from the perspective of Juan Jose, why would his community choose to grow coffee, this thing that was so destructive to them?
I will say it became like this unwelcome companion, right?
Mm-hmm.
A very not positive relationship, I will say.
Yeah.
But also if we think about like how indigenous communities think about the world, I will say that there is a differentiation in between like what we as humans are doing with this plant and the plant itself, which is not necessarily linked to colonialism, right?
Right, it's neutral.
Exactly, it's just like a vegetal life. Plant itself is not actually making the system, right?
Okay, so this is great, yes? Here we have specialty coffee. It's bringing prosperity in the early days of the specialty revolution. These high-grown Guatemalan coffees, they're selling for a premium. The premium is delivering, back to farmers a modest livelihood, but a sustainable livelihood that obviously they had struggled to access before.
Generally, it was a big boom for Mayan communities. This product that we used to sell for nothing, almost at a loss, we're now able to make some money on. No small farmers get rich off of coffee, but sometimes they save up their money and buy a truck or open a little tienda or do other things. It was huge in these rural Mayan communities that have been marginalized for generations, hundreds of years, in so many ways.
But then, the coffee market shifts again. There's even more money to be made now. But can Mayan communities take advantage of this? That's coming up next. So Jonathan, the rise of specialty coffee in the early 2000s is a very nice change to what has been historically a pretty dark story. But the thing is, as we know, specialty coffee is always evolving. And the specialty coffee of 25 years ago looks very different from the specialty coffee of today. The indigenous communities in Guatemala were able to make good money from what specialty coffee looked like 25 years ago. But as specialty coffee changes, were they still able to take advantage? And so let's just quickly touch on what did specialty coffee look like 25 years ago?
In the early 2000s, it's basically, look, have you got a coffee that tastes somewhat better or somewhat different from your basic commodity coffee? And the other thing, of course, is, origin is somewhat different at that point. To say it's a single origin probably means it comes from a single country or at least a single area. It doesn't have to be a single farm.
Right. And Ted actually told us a story of him going to a specialty coffee cafe back in the day, 25 odd years ago. And this is what he saw.
I remember I was living in New Orleans in the early days of specialty coffee, and when the coffee shop started putting up Kona or Guatemala or Blue Mountain, and Guatemala was one of those that made it into the early differentiation that way.
So, as Ted explained to us, the Mayan communities do really well in the early days of the specialty revolution.
Right. But as we know, specialty coffee shifts, it evolves. And it's really not that long after, in the 2010s and onwards, that a new era of specialty coffee begins. Whereas in that earlier period of specialty coffee, it was just really about a coffee from a single country or maybe a region and a coffee that tasted distinctly better than commodity. Fast forward 10 years, and now we have an increased focus on specific farms, on really interesting fermentation techniques, on very exotic varieties. And specialty coffees start to taste more and more distinct, interesting, different. And of course, prices also go up. And this is all fantastic for the farmers who produce these coffees. But as Ted points out,
the third wave revolution of really looking for particular named farms, unusual varietals, the Maya were left out of that.
the Maya struggled to capitalize on this new shift in the market. But here's the funny thing. Their neighbors, their literal neighbors, were actually able to take advantage of it and prosper.
In these highland areas, you had Mayan communities growing coffee. You also had a number of Ladino, non-Maya, middle-sized farms growing coffee in these same regions. They weren't the coffee oligarchy that we call the Germans and the others, but they were a little better off than the locals.
Just to clarify, these farmers who we're calling Ladinos, this is a kind of a mixed ancestry background. Some of their ancestry is European, some of it's indigenous, and they become, if you like, part of what Ted called them as the global middle class.
Right, so these are people who are not American or European level middle class, but middle class by Guatemalan standards.
So they were doing well enough that they may have sent their kids to the university in the capital. They may have taken a trip to the US or somewhere out of the country before.
And on those rare trips where they would leave Guatemala and went to America, their eyes were opened.
They saw what consumers were going for. You know, if you went to a coffee shop in Portland in 2000 and you saw what they were selling and you came back, you were able to present this.
They saw that prices were really good.
Prices continued to go up. Demand for higher and higher quality or more and more exotic coffees went up.
And they gave the market what it wanted: specialty flavours, exotic varietals, interesting fermentation techniques.
These middle-sized Ladino farmers just really taken off in the years since.
And they're able to charge a premium for that.
The market went to this next level where you're starting to pay $20 wholesale for coffee, where the market price is $1 or maybe $2, or even more than that.
Right, so here we have these Ladino farmers who are doing relatively better than the neighboring Mayan indigenous farmers. But why? Why weren't indigenous producers catering to this super specialty shift? And speaking further with Ted and Juan Jose, what began to emerge is actually there is a huge clash of values behind the values of specialty coffee compared to the values that indigenous communities hold. For example, to start with,
People are more attuned to how much coffee you produce, not how much money did you earn.
Juan Jose told me a story. At one point, he had a few sacks of very experimental specialty coffees with really interesting flavors. And he was able to sell them at a much higher price than, the regular coffee they were producing. But the reaction from his friends speaks volumes.
So I was talking to these friends of me that are also coffee farmers, and I was like, hey, do you know, I sell let's say 3 sacks at this price, right? And I was expecting them to be excited, right? And then they were like, oh yeah, but that's only 3, right?
His friends weren't impressed. 3 sacks? It's not very much. His friends didn't care about the price. They only cared about the quantity because that ties to the values of the community.
It speaks about your relationship with the land, right? The more you produce, the more blessed you are in somehow, right? The field is in somehow takes your personhood, right? As the person. It is like an extension of you. So the more your field produces, it's sort of the more wealthy you are. Let's say even in gender, the more men you are.
What matters within the community is not profit. It's about abundance. How much can you get from the land? How much can it provide you with? And that's really the status symbol within the culture.
Right. But that doesn't lend itself to specialty coffee. Specialty coffee is the opposite of volume. A lot of farmers who are focused on producing specialty coffees, they choose varieties of trees that don't produce very much volume. But what they do produce have great flavors, which they can sell for a higher price. So this cultural value on abundance is one reason why not so much specialty coffee is produced. But it goes further too. There are other ways in which Mayan values clash with the values of specialty coffee.
There is a value in collectivity.
So, Jonathan, in Juan Jose's community, a lot of things are done communally, which goes right back to what we covered in part 1, where Ted Fisher, he told us about how the indigenous communities of Guatemala managed their land before Europeans came along.
Ted's argument was, the Mayan communities, the land is seen as a collective good by the community. They have a system of allocation which varies from year to year depending upon your need.
And speaking with Juan Jose, he mentioned how today you can still see these collective systems at play in his town of Jacaltenango.
In Jacaltenango, we have like these concepts of guayab, which is taking turns to work in each other's plots of land. So we will do a guayab today with me. So I will go and let's say all help me to clean my field. Then next week we go to the others.
So Juan Jose's community has these strong collective values, but that actually works against producing super specialty coffees. Because super specialty coffees are all about uniqueness, specialness, being different from everybody else.
And I feel like this idea of like the specialty, the terroir, the specificities of this sensorial coffee, it's really very singularized to a specific field.
And so given this strong preference for collectivity, not doing it alone, singularizing your coffee production, Ted tells us that
Mayan farmers have a strong preference to work through cooperatives when they can.
In the cooperative, you tend to see all the members as equals.
And when Juan Jose explained the process of a farmer selling their coffee to the cooperative,
you go to the warehouse and there is like this person that is like, okay, hi, how are you? How much coffee are you coming? Just like 5 quintales. And that's all.
There's no mention of cupping scores. Members get paid based solely on quantity. And let's just say, hypothetically, you are a farmer up in Jacaltenango, Juan Jose's community, and you want to do things your own way. You want to grow specialty coffee, you want to have direct conversations with buyers, earn more money than the cooperative is able to get for you. In theory, you could do it. But Juan Jose mentions you're going to have a problem.
So that creates tension because you are in a world in which collectivity is value, not singularization.
To be clear, you are choosing to move out of your culture.
Right.
That's the point. You're choosing to contradict your cultural norm.
Absolutely.
All of these then are kind of interweaving reasons, interconnected reasons why these communities are left out of that shift into the super specialty world that we experience today.
Right. And so that then takes us to the question. If you want to buy a coffee from Guatemala, which coffee should you buy? What should you look for? That coming up next. So Jonathan, you want to buy a coffee from Guatemala? Guatemalan coffees are delicious.
They certainly are.
The question is, which farmer do you want to buy from?
And how do you know which that farmer is?
How do you figure it out?
Because, there are 3 different groups of farmers, right? So you've got the historic leftover of the coffee oligarchy, German plantation owners.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have this group of Ladinos, the people with a mixed heritage, European and indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the more clearly indigenous, the Maya produced coffees from those uplands.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's a spectrum, James. We've outlined 3 what we would call ideal types, as in, stereotypes. But basically, there are all kinds of different farms and backgrounds overlapping with each other.
But here's the thing, though, Jonathan. With a little bit of decoding, you might be able to figure out which kind of farmer we're talking about here. For example, oftentimes, when you look at a Guatemalan coffee, you might see it written 5th generation coffee producer, which to me as a coffee consumer, that's fantastic. Family business, long running, heritage. But Ted Fisher warns, you got to be careful, actually.
And so, a lot of those keywords that sound very attractive, 5th generation farmer or whatever it may be, could actually be red flags. A lot of times what you're seeing are legacy plantations.
Many consumers might think 5th generation farmer. You'll be supporting the sort of the struggling small indigenous farmer. But actually, if you think about this a bit, 5 generations doesn't take you far that back historically.
Mm.
And what you're actually supporting is probably the heirs, as it were, of the legacy settler, plantation owners,
Mm-hmm.
who are certainly going to be better off than the Mayan farmers.
Yes. It's funny, but Ted also mentions that there are very few of these plantations around anyway these days.
The large plantations are largely gone. This is crazy. This is the other thing that happened with the quality turn.
Right.
They're selling their land. They're moving to timber. They're doing mini hydroelectric. The market for commodity coffee is so up and down, and it's been down so much in recent decades. The old coffee oligarchy is getting out of coffee.
Wow.
No need to worry too much about them. They're doing fine. Their kids are working for investment banks in New York and London.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting is a bit of a trap, actually. You know, many consumers, they want organic coffees, fair trade coffees. And you would think, you know, fair trade works a lot with cooperatives. That's how they implement the certification system, is through cooperatives. And as we just heard, Mayan indigenous communities love to work in cooperative systems. But Ted says if you go for fair trade or organic, you might actually be excluding Mayan farmers.
We often also see lots of labels on bags these days, and those labels contribute to what we might think would be a Mayan approach to coffee, ecologically conscientious, respectful of labor, and so forth. And yet, all of those labeling regimes are very difficult to get and cost money for farmers. And so most smallholding Mayan farmers don't participate in those.
Right. So by choosing to pursue some kind of certification, you are excluding the possibility of buying Mayan coffee.
I wouldn't quite go that far, but yes, it's a barrier that may not be promoting the goals that the consumer is thinking.
So there's that. And now one other wrinkle, curveball to throw at you. If you're thinking of buying Guatemalan coffee, maybe from Mayan producers, if you are somebody who prioritizes exceptional coffee flavors, super specialty stuff, well, by prioritizing that, you might be excluding Mayan farmers. And you might probably be led towards a path of enjoying coffees from Guatemala from Ladino farmers who very much cater to that market.
I agree, James. And I think that's one of the great paradoxes of specialty coffee, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's something else too that I want to point out here. There are examples where, certainly I've seen in Guatemala, where you'll go to a Ladino farm and they will be providing services for their workers and pickers, who tend to be from indigenous communities, that are paid for by that coffee. So I've seen schools that are educating Mayan indigenous children in particular in agricultural techniques, in basic marketing techniques, and in language.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very morally difficult set of judgments here that we're making.
Yes. It's never been harder to be a conscious consumer.
The further you try to be conscientious, the more difficult it becomes.
But Jonathan, when we know there's a story, it does help change how we perceive a coffee.
Absolutely so.
The story literally changes our perceptions of the flavor. It's kind of the magic of the brain. If you as a consumer really want to buy Mayan coffee for what Mayan coffee has to offer, I asked Juan Jose, what is the story? What makes coffee from his region of Jacaltenango special?
I would say it's the history that coffee has in this specific place. You are tasting collective effort. You are tasting some of the arrangements that happened a couple of 100 years ago, right? When people get access to their land. It is also tasting the in-between, right? Tasting the in-between of engaging in capitalism, but also trying to maintain other sorts of values. And I think also the, let's say, environmental and these relationships are there. For example, if you are blessed by the land, right, you will produce. That's what it's in the cup of Jacaltenango's coffee.
Thank you very much for listening.
If you'd like to learn more about Ted Fisher's work, then obviously the best place to start is with his book, Making Better Coffee.
Juan Jose finishes his PhD next year, and it examines coffee farming in Jacaltenango, as he describes it, as a kind of alchemy, where ritual, ecology, and generational memory all shape how a farmer decides to tend the land. You can follow him on LinkedIn to learn more. We've got links in the show notes.
So, this is the last episode of Series 3. Wow.
Final episode, Jonathan.
The final
It's
episode.
over already. I feel like it hardly even began.
I sense that we might find we're doing a bonus episode because there's been so much here.
So much.
But yeah, if you want more episodes, let us know.
Tell us. You can get us on our Instagrams. I'm at Filter Stories Podcast.
And I'm at Coffee History JM. On Instagram, I'll use illustrations to go further into the history of settlers and coffee in Guatemala.
And on my Instagram, I will have images of what coffee cultivation looks like today in Jacaltenango. And if you haven't already, you should absolutely pick up Jonathan's book.
Thank you, James. It's called Coffee, A Global History.
Link in the show notes.
Should you wish to reward James, you can buy him a coffee at
Coffee.com. It's a platform like Patreon, but run by nicer people, where you can contribute to my work so I can continue to make these sorts of documentaries for you.
And just to be clear, coffee is spelled Ko-Fi.
Link in the show notes.
We want people to tell all their friends about this episode. Press subscribe, rate and review, and what should they do when they go onto Instagram, James?
Yeah, one way that really helps to get new people knowing about this podcast is create a screen grab of your podcast player listening to this episode, share it as a story, tag Jonathan and I, because that way we can thank you and repost it.
Absolutely will. So, A History of Coffee is produced by James Harper and myself, Professor Jonathan Morris.
I edit the episodes. I also write and play the piano music.
And if I may say, I compliment you on your music for Series 3.
Thank you. I am available for weddings.
There's no need to put a desperate advert out there.
Great. Well, until next time, let's not try and make it 3 years between series like we did between Series 2 and 3, Jonathan.
Was it really? Incredible.
If you want a series sooner than that, let us know. Until next time,
It's goodbye from me.
ciao, ciao.
And one final thought, whatever you decide to buy from Guatemala, enjoy your coffee.